Saw our panel, just took a picture. It's pretty cool. Well, thank you again for attending the 8th annual Startup Boston Week. My name is Mohammed, and I'll be your host today, so I'm just excited to see so many beautiful faces. And thank you again to Suffolk University's Sawyer Business School for hosting this conference. As you know, this downtown location is the perfect hub for exploring Boston's innovation ecosystem and learning from industry leaders. The goal behind Startup Boston Week is connecting the ecosystem of Greater Boston and New England. And all industries, all startup departments, all bootstrap and funding stages for 5 days of learning. Just out of curiosity, show of hands, who was here yesterday? All right, that's lovely, that's lovely. Obviously these individuals are a wealth of knowledge, so you'll be learning a lot today. The team that creates Startup Boston Week is primarily volunteers, and folks working the conference today here are volunteering all their time. So thank you for attending this conference. It's a labor of love, as Stephanie always says. And we appreciate you playing a role in this and shaping the community. So again, thank you, and I welcome Reb.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Rabeh Majidi. I'm also a startup founder, and this is my second year. I'm supporting Stephanie at the Startup Boston. So we have a great panel today. I just want to give you a heads up that Kyle Kearse, our moderator, stuck in traffic. Unfortunately, he had a lot of passion. He helped me to design this panel. But he's still driving, hoping he can at least attend the session. But special thank you to our panelists that accepted my invitation. And we have a wonderful moderator, Richard, that is going to take over. So let's get it started. We're almost late.
Awesome. Let's go. Let's have this. Brilliant. Okay, so as Rabi said, standing in for Kyle, he's my fellow co-host of the MedTech Impact podcast. I am Richard Meiklejohn. On my day job, I'm normally an innovation leader, and I've worked with the likes of Rabi, helping medical device and biotech companies to commercialize their technologies. I'm super excited for me personally because I was a student here, so it's nice to return back to Suffolk University. So let's kick things off. How many people here are startups? Do we have any startups in the room? We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Keep your hands up. Are you counting here? We got a good count? Okay. So great to have the startup representation. Clearly, our topic today, navigating cultural challenges. Well, Kyle had a challenge today just getting through the Boston traffic. We know how that is, so unfortunately can't be here. But as we know, Boston is one of the most cosmopolitan, well-educated places on the planet. So navigating challenges in terms of your local environment are absolutely critical, let alone if you want to connect with an international audience. So I think the importance of today's panel for everyone to understand and discuss, and this is connected, so I see someone's on the phone. Are you connected? You here? Back of the room? Come on. Yep. You, sir? That's it. We're connected. That's it. So cultural challenges. Let's stay connected because that's ultimately, we're in a connected world. So we want to overcome these barriers. And so we have a fantastic panel. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So I'm going to start off with you, Kim, please.
Oh, okay. Let's see if we can. Hi, my name is Kim Rydell, and for the past 20 years, I've been involved as a leader in customer success in software, in platforms, technology platforms, helping post-sales teams. And that has been domestically as well as globally. And the majority of the industries that I have been in digital media, advertising technology, and marketing technology. So hopefully I can offer some perspective when we go talk about global.
Awesome. And then moving down the line, Evan, please.
There we go. My name's Evan Pierce. I'm head of people and culture for the Boston Celtics.
Woo! Go Celtics!
Yeah. Before this, I actually built my career in technology. So I was in Apple, Hewlett-Packard, and Raven Industries. And I'm actually an advisor for the People Tech Partners out in San Francisco that helps support startups and advise them from first round to hopefully going public. So that's a little bit about my experience, and have been in human resources for the last 10 plus years.
Perfect. Great. I'm Mark Cody, really happy to be here this morning as well. I grew up in an entrepreneurial family, and after college, joined the entrepreneurial services group at EY. So entrepreneurship has been part of my life in my entire career. And after about 20 years with E&Y and then Dunkin' Brands, I really moved over into the startup world, initially with a private equity-backed drug development consulting company, where then the president of that group and I, we created our own consulting company helping biotechs develop their drugs. Then we were fortunate to found 2 biotech companies, raised about $25 million of venture capital for one, so I'm aware of dilution that founders oftentimes face, the challenges of pitching, and then these days I work as a leadership and executive coach, oftentimes with founders, their entrepreneurial teams, and the up-and-comers in their organizations as well. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone. So a stellar lineup. Looking forward to get fired in. So as always, we're going to set the stage. So to kick things off, let's start with the basics. What does culture really mean in the context of business, internally and externally? And why is it important for startups, to pay attention, especially when entering new markets? So maybe we can start with you, Kim.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that you need to pay attention to when you're looking at global markets is really what's going to drive the sales and the marketing aspects, and that can be very different than it is within the United States. And so when you're going out and looking at hiring people within those markets, usually startups that I've been involved in, they're going into one market first, and then taking the learnings from that particular market and then applying them to other places. So typically what I've seen is that they start off with an English-speaking country, like somewhere in the UK, like London, England, and then usually move to a country that's outside of that area. And I think just keeping in mind that England is very different than the United States. And then if you want to go into other countries, especially in the APAC region, it's very, very different. And so hiring somebody who's local can certainly help with those types of challenges.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I think from the HR side, culture is a combination of the values, the systems, the beliefs, and really powerful experiences that happen over time. And I think in the startup community, it's beautiful because you're going to have so many of those so fast, very quickly. And you got to be careful on what those specifically are, because that will help shape and mold your business and culture moving forward. So, as the company grows and they instill those early set of principles and values and beliefs and shared experiences. So if it's not curated appropriately, it could, whether it's in the local market or global, it could have a negative impact.
Yeah. I'd actually like to ask a question of the audience, if I could, just so we get a better context of who's here. In terms of the startup folks, how many of you guys are already global? Anybody yet? So maybe one out there. So I guess the comments that we make aren't only going to be relevant globally, but I really look at them as relevant locally too, as you're setting up your organization. So whether you're a founder now who's just local or going global, I think all of these comments are going to be very relevant. And similar to what Kim and Evan shared, I tell folks that I work with is culture trumps strategy every day of the week. You want to have a good strategy, but ultimately, if you're growing your organization as a founder, or you're thinking of joining an organization, you really want to make sure that there's a good cultural fit. So I would encourage you, if you're the founder or the leader, it's the tone at the top. You are going to be creating an organization that is going to embrace or carry the values that are important to you, and it's important to get those out there. As Evan said, values are really key. So I oftentimes encourage the founders as they're thinking about setting up their organizations, have an intentional culture. Don't let it be an accidental culture. So really be thoughtful about your values. Sometimes when I'm dealing with early stage entrepreneurs, like, we'll get to values later. Well, if you don't design the values or define them in advance and start to reinforce them, a culture is going to develop and it may not be the one that you want. So I really encourage you to be intentional about what you want for your organization, because it'll have an influence throughout your team.
Amazing. So, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, I know Mark and I, we've talked about this before, is that sometimes when you're hiring or when you're looking at even just across the United States, that there are ultimately very different cultures. And for obviously all of you are in Boston, and if you take a look at what we have here just within Boston, it can be very different than what is even in San Francisco or is in San Diego or LA. And so you do really really, like Mark said, have to be sort of intentional what your culture is, and then making sure that you are applying that diversity, and that diversity can be across the United States, but being very thoughtful in that approach.
Fantastic, and I love that point, Mark. You know, the old slang that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's the famous line. So yeah, it's so important to recognize how important culture is, and it's the foundation of your business from that day and that get-go, day one, should I say. You know, it's absolutely important to embed that into it. So I'm wondering if we can just skip forward and thinking about some of the strategies or frameworks, you know, in terms of addressing these challenges. Kim, you know, what would be some of the ways you would try to address these challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of what Mark is saying is being very thoughtful in what the values are for your organization, and then making sure that when you are looking to go global and go into another country, is how can I hire or apply those values within the constructs of that particular country? Because things that are sometimes valued in the United States are not always valued in other countries. So you really just have to make sure that it does fit in with the values of the organization and the direction. So strategy does, you know, strategy matters, but I think it's being very thoughtful with values plus strategy in those countries.
Yeah, I really think about this as when a company is founded and it starts to blossom, the lead people in that company are like the chief product officers. And you probably have less than 20 employees, if that, you know, and you're trying to grow the business, and that's part of the culture. That's where you're at. You're trying to figure out your rhythm and your movements. And then it kind of, you know, those people in those leadership positions almost become like chief decision makers. So there's a different mindset as you continue to grow and you continue to scale, and eventually kind of gets to a third place where, you know, hopefully you know, you're becoming more chief like inspiration officer, right? Because you have a larger group where you're trying to inspire and motivate, where you may not know every single person's face, and you know that's an interesting space to be in. And obviously, I take a lot of pride and passion in being able to partner with leaders around that and how they grow and how they shape their businesses. But it can be even a little more sensitive even when you start growing out internationally into different countries. You know, from India to China to the U.S., even locally here. You know, I was coming from California, so you know, for me, it was not used to Dunkin' Donuts as a staple. Yeah. So that was a must. That we're partnering with the Boston Celtics on that. So.
And Mark, if you're thinking specifically for a startup, like what would be some of the frameworks or ways you would approach getting forward to address some of these potential challenges?
Yeah, so as a leader, we hear a lot about diversity, and diversity is a great thing, but oftentimes people feel much more comfortable working with people that look and feel and believe the same that they do. So there's an organization out there called the Trust Edge Leadership Institute, and they really study what top organizations and some of the aspects that those most successful organizations have in terms of building trust. And what they found that oftentimes diversity may actually inhibit innovation in the early days, because you may not necessarily trust those around you because you see the differences as opposed to the commonalities. So as a leader looking to grow your organization, I would really encourage you not only think about the tasks that need to be done to get your product or service launched forward, but then think about the people aspect of it and be very intentional about making sure that you're developing the relationships, allowing people to see the commonalities, because to get to the next level of greatness depends upon the quality of the culture, which depends upon the quality of the relationships, but it all starts with conversations. So you need to have your people speaking, and hopefully they're speaking the same language, not necessarily physical language, but in terms of the values and how they're thinking and working together. So I would make sure that we're just very intentional about helping to develop the team in order to accomplish what we want, Richard.
Brilliant.
And I can elaborate on that. Just
Yeah,
that's a really,
good.
That's a really good point. And my head's foggy from coming in from Boston traffic, so I'm sorry. I didn't answer the actual question on strategy. So I think when I think about being able to partner with an organization, it's around the people, the process, and the product and the technology, and I'll kind of encompass the culture. There's a great framework from Josh Burson, who a former Deloitte consultant, who now has his own practice. It's called the Irresistible Organization, and it really frames out in a very beautiful way really what culture is in the end, from wellness to what you're talking about with trust, and how do you cultivate that across your organization continuously. And so that's a good framework to, feel free to Google it, but it's a really good framework to kind of like start somewhere and explore. So.
Yeah, and I think I would add to that, just one of the things that you mentioned but didn't call out is sort of the collaboration, and I think really being prescriptive about bringing people in. I've worked at startups where we've gone global in a high growth stage, but then we haven't recognized that we need to include people within their time zone. We need to include people in the conversation and the decisions. And I think that is something that you really, when you're developing that strategy, yes, you want the values, but you do really need to think about those types of things so that it is a collaborative environment so that you can all move forward at the same time.
Yeah, if I could just build on that as well. I know one of the organizations I was working with who were across multiple time zones, when they would send out just meeting invites or even just emails, they would typically put the time zones right in the emails so that the people in those respective time zones would know what it meant to them. It wasn't always just Eastern time, it was Pacific or GMT or whatever it was, to make it really easy for people to convert. It just showed respect for your colleagues.
Yeah, and the attention to those little details can clearly make a difference. Something as small as just understanding the time zone, and to your point, Mark, being respectful of that. And I think as much as we discuss the opportunity, clearly there are some risks that need to be considered when we're thinking about cultural differences. So I'm wondering how you think about managing cultural risks. I know Evan, you mentioned Dunkin' Donuts, which is obviously a US brand, but I think from wider afield, obviously the Boston Celtics is a global brand. So how do you think about managing that potential risk of how you engage with the fan base?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll give you a good example. So right now we're going through a little bit of global expansion on our business on the Boston Celtics. For some people, hey, you think it's just a basketball team, but we're actually encompass, which is called kind of Banner 17. Underneath that, you have the Boston Celtics, the Maine Celtics, it's a minor league team out in Portland, Maine, and then we have a Celtics gaming operation. In addition to that, we also have a nonprofit foundation, and we've just been able to have license over the last year is actually explore international opportunities for expanding our growth. And we're getting ready to, I'll put this plug on October 4th and October 6th, our global games in Abu Dhabi. And so there's been able to, us be able to build relationships out there. And it's been an interesting process as we kind of expand globally is really kind of building the team up to ensure that they're kind of equipped and prepared to deal and navigate through a new market for us. And we have cultural kind of immersion training to get them prepared to kind of understand what it's like to just work out there, kind of engage with clients, to even back of house, like how do we reflect on how we're approaching things and how we've been so localized and focused here in Boston, and how do we kind of expand our mindset a little bit as we go out to a whole new territory. So that's happening very soon, and we're kind of building and training our staff up to prepare for that.
Can I actually ask Evan a follow-on question for that as well? So, because interestingly, we mentioned Dunkin' Donuts. I worked for Dunkin' for 12 years as part of my career, so that's pretty cool. But I know one of the things that was important for us in a lot of brands is to really have a consistent brand representation, regardless of where it is across the globe. So I guess as the Celtics are thinking to go more global, how are you holding that brand, or what does that brand represent? Is it different in different countries? I guess, how are you guys thinking about that?
Yeah, I think it's also just it's a great question. It's a deep understanding of how the kind of the Celtics are founded. If you kind of walk through some of our walls and the arena, you kind of feel the kind of maybe more the Irish kind of culture encompassing the Celtics brand, and it feels like a natural default. But we realize we're one of the one or two teams that kind of expand across almost every single country. Internationally, it's us and the Los Angeles Lakers. And I think as we started to kind of build that data set and that data point, that, now we're able to say, hey, when we expand to new markets, like our brand, we don't have a ton of employees, so our brand is going to carry us. So everyone has to be kind of stewards of the brand, understand where we were at, where we're going, and how do we prepare for that when we enter those new markets. So that's how I think about it.
Yeah, so I guess whether you're a startup operating or expanding domestically or potentially internationally, I guess it's helpful to define your brand and how do you want to be seen in the marketplace by employees, by customers, or others as well. So there's consistency and you have control over it. Yeah, great.
And Kim, maybe to put you on the spot, but again, with the startups in mind, I guess if you were thinking like just getting started, and you've got limited resources like most startups do, like, where do you get started? What's going to be the top of the list in terms of when you're thinking about risk and managing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we're staying on that sort of that brand focus, it is hard when you are going, you're a startup, you don't have the resources, you don't have the people, you don't have probably the marketing dollars to invest in your brand. And so it really does rely on the people within that market. So I've been in tech, so I've been in ad tech and martech, and a lot of times the way we, when we're growing and doing growth into those new markets, culturally, what we are or globally, what we try and do, or what we've tried to do in the past is find somebody in market that, so if we're going into the UK, for example, we want to find somebody in that market that already has maybe a foothold. So maybe doing some sort of alliance, maybe where we start is doing an alliance with a company that already has a foothold in that market, in that region, and then using that to get our name out there. So we're using their name to get our name there. And then other ways that it has been done has been pairing up, and again, I'm talking about tech. Ad tech or MarTech is pairing up with agencies in a region. So go in with your brand, but tie it to a bunch of agencies who are going to help to, be almost your reseller of your brand within that market. So it's a lower cost way to get into those regions.
That's really great advice. I think obviously leveraging that local knowledge and intelligence is absolutely paramount. And I found it really interesting, Evan, that example you gave about the Irish part of the Boston Celtics, because I think, as much as there are differences, we want to, just going to
Chuck's
pause for a
joining.
second.
Oh, it took 3 hours to get here this morning.
Kyle's still driving, so
Is he?
yeah,
Yeah.
in good company.
That's a record, by the way. Sorry to interrupt.
That's
I
okay.
apologize.
So we'll come on to do a short introduction in a moment for you, Chuck. But yeah, just to finish off that question, thinking about those cultural differences, and again, how do you then turn that around and say, well, that could be our competitive advantage to actually, make that difference stand out? And again, you give that example of the sort of the Irish slant for the Boston Celtics.
Yeah, I mean, you lean into it. You lean into your strengths. So you want everyone in the organization to be multipliers. You find the kind of mediums that help people speak out and represent the brand and articulate it. Like LinkedIn is a great, incredible untapped place for allowing that to happen and for everyone to kind of be marketers and brand stewards. And so you kind of created some ecosystems around supporting employees to help do that and carry and extend the brand. So I'm a big component on the employer branding side of the house and being able to partner with our marketing team really dynamically on how do we explore that, how do other people kind of reshare and be able to post out kind of what we're doing as an organization.
Amazing.
I was going to say I worked for a company where we went into China. We had been in most of EMEA, and we decided to go into China. And what I found very interesting was to bring our brand to China. We started off with one woman who was the managing director, who was a fanatic of our technology, which was culturally great. But the way she approached the market and looked at it was, I think, very different than even the founders thought that they would look at it. She looked at it as the brand that was going to bring the Americans to them. And so they just went after companies and used our brand to go after companies so that they could bring their product into the United States. So she almost reversed what we were doing. And it was fantastic because we were able to expand within China through her and bringing these brands that were Chinese brands into the U.S. And that's how we expand our name and our brand into China that way. It was I thought it was a little bit of a reversal.
Richard, yeah, can I comment a little bit as well? Because you asked about how, as an early stage founder or startup, are you managing some of the risk of advancing your technology as part of that whole process? And one of the key things for the founders of the startup world is you're raising money and you need to identify how do you get to the next value inflection point. Whether you're going to angels or institutional, venture, private equity, they're putting a certain amount of dollars at risk behind you. You need to make sure that you keep your eye on the ball so that you get to the next really value inflection point, so you get to a next financeable milestone. Because you're going to have to raise, whether it be the Series A or the Series B afterwards. So you need to be very focused on the activities. But I say that you also have to be focused on the people. And sometimes it doesn't cost a lot of money to be focused on your people, but you just need to be aware of it because you need to make that progress, but you can't. People are messy, people are complicated, but people are critical. So you need to make sure that you're doing the things as well to cultivate your team, to recognize them, to reward them. It doesn't always have to be financial, but oftentimes it's, recognition in other ways to keep them engaged.
Okay, Chuck, if you want to do a brief introduction before I just land you a question on you, but yeah.
Sure. What would you like me to say? Who I am?
Let the audience know,
Okay.
yeah, who
Sorry,
you
I
are.
apologize again. So I'm a CEO and founder of a firm called MCG Partners. We're a leadership and organizational effectiveness consulting firm. We've been in business for 17 years. I've been in consulting most of my career. I was a CEO previously of a global consulting firm. I've started several businesses in my career, typically for other firms, but then on my own. I've done a lot of work in the private equity, venture capital space with CEOs and founders of companies as an advisor, as a coach, as a consultant, as well as my firm. So that's me.
Awesome. So I'm sensing there, Chuck, and we're going to throw this next question right back on you, but put you on the spot. But yeah, clearly leadership is going to be huge when we're talking about trying to address these cultural challenges and navigate the complexity. And I think about in the startup world, we're just talking there about limited resources. So for you as a leader in a startup, what's that way you're approaching embedding that culture to navigate those challenges?
Yeah, so I'm happy I was able to hear 3 great responses, earlier, and I want to piggyback really kind of on all 3 in a way. So it's difficult when you're first starting a business, right? You're scrambling, to your point, to establish financing. You're in survival mode. You're trying to get your business off the ground. Whatever your product or service may be, including expanding that in other markets, not just here in the U.S., but internationally and globally. But I would still say that part of one's success formula, besides your product and your solution and your vision, is this whole notion of purpose, of who you are, and the kind of organization you're trying to build. Because if you don't really define that early on, starting with really your first hire and beyond, you're really trying to, going back to your point, Evan, you're trying to create that brand of who you are, what kind of organization you want to be. And this whole reflection of your internal brand to your external brand is really critical to me. So it really starts from the very beginning. And that's really your first step as a leader. And let's face it, when you're starting a business, leadership is not exactly top of your priority. You're in survival and growth mode and trying to hit certain metrics. But you really need to take a step back and say, as I begin this journey of adding people and trying to find a certain type of skill set and expertise, I'm also trying to develop a culture. And we talk about culture clearly in terms of going to the markets and different geographies and different parts of the world. But in your own organization, your culture is that brand. It's why do people want to work here? What is their experience going to be? What is that journey? Now, again, you can't necessarily extrapolate a vision of how that's all going to pan out as you're in survival mode and you're building something. But if you look at all the great successful organizations over the last 10, 15 years, they all started with a founder that not just had a vision in terms of their product and their services, they had an experience in mind of what their employees were going to have as being part of that journey. And so I would highly recommend that you really create some understanding of what that purpose, that vision, that brand is going to be internally as you build this culture of who you are and why people want to work there and what that experience is going to be. And to your point, how you're going to recognize, how you're going to reward, what your values are, what's important to you. And again, goes back to that employee experience. You're going to have a customer experience, but you have to have an employee experience. That's where that internal, external brand really are critical in terms of how you connect that.
And you make such an interesting point around having so many things to do as a startup. You might think well, where does cultural strategy fit into all this? But Kim, if you're thinking about hiring that next person, how would you approach, sort of embedding that from day one?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to obviously look at, what the skills are, but you also, I obviously look at it from a sales and customer success perspective because I've been in those markets. And a lot of times when you are going into a new market, you are looking for somebody who is going to be able to push your brand, sell your brand. So when I've gone to hire somebody in a new region at a startup, typically you don't have a lot of money, so that first hire is extremely important. So it's really vetting those people, making sure that that person has that connections, the clout in that market, and then also that they fit in with the values. And fortunately or unfortunately, I think for that first hire in a new market, you really need to have them meet with a majority of people who are within the organization already, and see that they can collaborate, that they can match up, and then also look at their track record. Are they able to sell in that market and to drive sales within that market, because they will be your brand. And so, referencing that woman that I spoke about in China, you really need to think about, what is this person going to represent? Is that person going to be able to represent you? Because as a founder, they will be that representation.
Any more to expand on, Evan, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, after the first hire, I think if you're looking to scale your organization and find the mold fix, and there's ways to extrapolate that. It's kind of curiosity, character, and communication, right? And those ingredients, I feel, allow for you to bring in the right people, if assessed correctly, and really effectively. And not that you discount expertise. When we're in that startup mode, you're wanting people, how can they digest and critically think through a problem? How do they effectively communicate that back out and get the right buy-in? How do you be insanely curious about the role, insanely curious about the market, the industry, the opportunity ahead? And so those are really strong attributes that then you can take someone and mold them into a newer business. And I'm a big proponent of that. So I think those are a lot of those attributes that we look for. And we even look for those as well when I was at Apple as well.
Yeah, if I could actually just build on what Chuck was saying before as well, because I think it's so critical, especially if you're a founder or you're a startup or thinking of one. What is your purpose? Like, why do you exist? Why should anybody care, right? You need to get really clear with what your purpose is, and then from there you can go about developing your mission in terms of what you will do, your vision about where you're going, your values in terms of how you're going to work and how people are going to engage with one another. But get really clear with your purpose, because it can help you in the hiring of employees, because if those employees resonate with your purpose, they may take less money because they believe in what you're doing. We see that a lot of times in the life sciences community, for instance, or sometimes even in tech. So that's really key. And then as you're interviewing, I oftentimes recommend it can be competitive, but slow down. You want to make sure that you make the right hire. And there's a number of different dimensions that actually go into getting the right person. Because if you hire the wrong person, it's painful for everybody, and it's sometimes hard to extract. So take your time, leverage, assessments, leverage, behavioral-based interviewing, do the references. Carnegie Foundation did a study of a number of years ago. What were the top attributes of top employees out there? And what they identified is they have a good level of knowledge, what they know, skills, how they apply it. But in fact, that was only 15% of the entire equation. Attitude was 85%. So make sure that you're evaluating that. So you want somebody, especially in an early startup, who's that can do, willing to work outside the box. So really be thoughtful about the hiring so that you don't regret it months down the line.
And that's really the perfect segue to our next question, because clearly we live in this data-driven culture. So I'm wanting to think now and turn the corner thinking about metrics. How are you measuring success when it comes to what you're embedding into the company and how people perceive you? Maybe we can start off with you, Chuck.
Well, not to overly state the obvious, but clearly success, as an early stage is really about the now, right? It's about demonstrating you've got some traction with your capability and what you're trying to provide in the marketplace. So you got to really focus, and it's really laser focus for everybody whether you're just on your own or whether you got one person or a small team, there has to be real clarity and alignment on what that success is on a short-term basis. And everything really should be focused on that, because you've got to demonstrate to your investors or however you're getting funding that you have a viable enterprise, a viable solution that can be successful. So I think sometimes it's really easy to get distracted by so many things, including some of the things we're talking about. But as someone who's done it several times, I can speak from experience that laser focus on your metric of success financially in terms of people purchasing your products or services and demonstrating some traction and retention of that, and then some early growth. That's really critical. And frankly, the other really big piece of that is your ability to shift quickly, right? Because we all have the greatest ideas in the world, especially when you're an entrepreneur. And I can give you a real example. I remember one particular solution that it was a huge demand in the marketplace, I shouldn't say demand, excuse me, a huge need in the marketplace. It was very clear. The data was there, the research was there, that the value proposition was clear as day. I rolled out this solution. This is early, probably maybe 15, 16 years ago, thinking it was going to be a home run. Crickets. Crickets. Literally. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, I already was a pretty established person in my career. It's like I was doing this for the first time. It was a very valuable lesson because, if there is no demand, even though you may think it's the best solution in the world, if the demand isn't there, if the interest isn't there, move on or shift or recalibrate or modify what your strategy is. So your ability to be nimble and to shift quickly, depending on the feedback you're getting from customers, early experience, that's really, really critical.
Yeah, Mark, I see you're itching to jump in.
I know there's so many things that I love commenting on because it's all great. And I just want to make sure we reinforce some of those things for you guys so that you hear it and can embrace it in your organizations as well. And so, Richard, you mentioned, how are you making sure you focus? And Chuck, you mentioned you can do so many different things. You need to focus on your top 5. What are the top 5 priorities that you have for your organization, and what's your top 1 of 5? And you need to make sure that you're working on that every day because that's going to be potentially most important to your survival. So it was interesting. I was speaking with an executive recently. I said, what's your top 5? He told me 11 different things. I'm like, none of them are priorities. So you're not going to get 11 things done. What are your top 5 and what's your top 1 of 5? So I encourage you, think about that and make sure that that cascades down to your organization as well so that you have others behind you that are supporting those priorities. Really, really important. I'm sure Evan can probably comment on that too.
Yeah, a couple things that come to mind. One is annual revenue per employee. So as you're in that growth stage, how are you keeping those things balanced? Are you growing at a faster rate than your staff are bringing in? And that kind of is a good indicator of a number of different things. The other ones is kind of structuring your early on, kind of creating a goal framework, a really agile goal framework called Objective Key Results, OKRs. So I think they're really effective in startup organizations because they move a lot quicker. Everyone can see alignment, and then we can adjust and pivot as we need to. Thinking a little bit more of those traditional ways, it can be tough, and then you keep those at 3 priorities max in my mind. And you move around those 3 priorities, whether you're a CEO or down the organization, that creates really strong alignment and more focus on the execution. So kind of what the top company in the world, which I had worked for 4 years ago, was Apple. And one of the things that they pride themselves in, they do really, really well and we're able to scale at, is from the startup to where they're at today, because their level of execution, they were cutting the peanut 30 times, right? And so that level of focus was driven. There's some frameworks like OKRs and other things. And then the other culture piece early on kind of came into play with, when you talk about kind of the irresistible organization and then being mindful of those other things as you start to build out. So those are kind of things that I think about in my head. So.
The only other comment I would make is I think having OKRs and having a focus is so important, and not changing them on, every month or every quarter, because you will just, your employees will have whiplash. But all the other thing I would say is, when you're going into a new country or you're going into a new region, is really to think about the OKRs obviously are going to cascade down, but the metrics may be different that you want to succeed, and be realistic about what those metrics are, so that those people in region can have some wins early on, and that they are showing that they are rolling up to those top 3 or 5 priorities of the company, and that they are rolling up to the OKRs.
And one other thing I was thinking about was regrettable attrition, right? So as you, like, who's actually not just attrition, but actually regrettable attrition around your people. That's going to be a really important indicator. And there's a number of ways you can kind of cut at it. But one of the things that you can always ask as a leader in your organization, are they making your job easier or harder? And would you hire them again? And if you think about that, like, oh, okay, as you grow, you can pivot to different different stages that could change. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so we spoke about before about leveraging your differences and how that can be still something that can make you unique with your brand. But I'm wondering now about, how do you adapt your communication styles without losing that brand identity? And so it's like, maybe kind of the other side of those things, where you want to more align but not lose your identity and what makes you unique, but clearly to try to align with all these different cultures and differences we see across the world. Kim, maybe we could start with you.
Don't start with me. Yeah, I mean, I think I've seen it done really well. Again, I think I keep going back to the same thing that Mark started with, is that if you've aligned with values, then you do, everything sort of lines up. I can't think of anything more, other than going with that. So I'll pass it on to Evan and Mark.
Yeah, I think it's empathy, right? You put yourself in other people's shoes and understand those different spaces, and then you take action across it. That creates and breeds a healthy culture as you expand, and breeds trust and all these other attributes that start to come into play. But and I think it starts with the top and it starts with the leadership team. And if that's not being done consistently, then I think you'll have problems as you move out into different markets and try to scale as a business.
So one of the reasons I got into coaching is, when I reflected back in my career, one of the things I enjoyed most was when I could mentor, kind of guide, advise, and develop those behind me. And that was really, really rewarding for me. And we realized that everybody has certain strengths, as well as maybe opportunity areas and/or blind spots. So as a coach these days, I'm really a big proponent of doing assessments so that people can understand their behavioral style. I'm just curious, how many of you here have heard of the concept of DISC, D-I-S-C? Good, actually, so a number of you have. So if anybody's interested, I have these DISC bookmarks up here as well. You can take them. Because what it does, so DISC, for those of you that haven't, it helps you identify your behavioral style. Some of us may have seen Myers-Briggs, which is a personality type indicator. This is about behavior. And you have 4 predominant different behavioral types, a D, I, S, and C. And each one of those has certain strengths. But if those strengths are over-leveraged or overutilized, they can start to become a weakness and actually a detriment to a culture or an organization. So it's really important for people to understand their own style so that they can identify it, understand it, and appreciate it. But then they get better at being able to identify, understand, and appreciate the styles of those around them. And that's really powerful, because then you can adapt. There's a concept out there, the golden rule: treat others like you want to be treated. We've all basically heard about that. Something out there called the platinum rule of communication. You communicate to others in the way in which they should be communicated to. So if there's somebody who likes the details, likes to go a little bit slower, you give them more details, you slow down. Whereas if there may be a high D, that director driving type, give them the big picture. Say, this is what we need done, just go. And that's probably all that they need. So I encourage you, look to learn your own style and then appreciate those around you as well, and you'll be a much more effective communicator and performer in your organization.
Yeah, I was going to add to that. You find out a lot about kind of decision-making and leadership through when it's under pressure.
Yeah.
Right? And you can just observe the room. And I always like those stances where I can observe the room under a lot of pressure, because then I can ask questions either in that moment or as a follow-up. But but you get to feel out who's an influencer, who's a driver, who's more conscientious, needs a lot of data and facts and putting things together. And there's, there's other areas too, who's a little bit slower, who loves the process, who wants to kind of nurture that along. And then you kind of pick your spots in those 4 quadrants, and that helps you be more effective, I think, in the earlier stages of driving impact in the organization.
Can I ask you a question about that, Evan? Because it could be the Celtics. This could be interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
So if we think about the 4 disc styles, and you're going to put a team out on the floor, do you want 5 Ds out there? Tell us a little bit about how you think about these styles and what you might want out there on the floor.
Yeah, I probably wouldn't be able to count.
Evan's coaching.
Yeah,
So
I'm not going to be the best, but I think when you put a high-performing team together, I mean, you're going to have, I mean, you're putting the best of best, and it's incredible once they get out in the court. But there's a lot of orchestration. I mean, the level of talent profiling is, when you think about like the normal hiring on a startup stage, they're going times 5, times 10 of what you normally kind of expect and see. I mean, they're looking at, your family, your friends, who you associate with, what businesses that you have, to like how you're thinking about how you perform in the court and looking at every little thing possible, in addition to kind of, how you're engaging and interacting on the court with someone else. And so they have to kind of experiment with a lot of different scenarios. This is kind of an agile process through the startup of kind of the season, and mixing and matching different players and combos when you talk about on the court around, and it's less of off the court engagement. It's more like how do they play and connect on the court, and it's like a puzzle piece. And once you kind of start to figure that out, you have a little bit of window to play with it, but it becomes pretty short pretty quick.
yeah.
No, I love the conversation. I'm very familiar with DISC, Mark, and everyone has their favorites, by the way, and many of you may not been exposed to behavioral assessments. We're actually a predictive index shop. We're very familiar with DISC. There's a lot of great assessments out there. Not to get into evaluation of all behavioral assessments, they're not created equal. There are some that have advantages over others, without getting into all that. But I do suggest understanding not just the strengths, as Mark was mentioning, we're talking about here, but just really, it's not about understanding behavior. It's about understanding what motivates and drives people, and how people show up in a work environment, especially under pressure and stress, and understanding their styles. But that whole notion of motivation and drive is critical. And one of the reasons we use predictive index, not just for leadership development and leadership alignment, because alignment of teams at any level is really critical, but also the people you're trying to hire. So going back to brand, going back to culture, going back to values, you want to hire people that are cultural fit, not just role fit. And I would recommend any startup, and we do a lot of work in the PE space, where they use the analytics to understand what kind of person am I hiring. Why I like PI is we can use predictive index, for selection in addition to development. You can use it throughout the talent manager life cycle. So my only advice here would be careful what assessments you use. They're not all created equal. Some are really effective in a work environment, some are not. And I also think that, as we talk about leadership and culture, this whole notion of feedback, right? So, there are tools out there like 360 assessments. Essentially, the concept there is ability in a confidential way to give each other feedback. For a startup, I would say create an environment where you're allowed to be giving and receiving feedback, period, verbally. Create an environment where it's transparent, it's open, it's safe to be able to say, as a founder, as a leadership team, it's just a small group of employees, how do we give each other really constructive, valuable, courageous feedback and input? To me, the combination of that, do I understand myself? Do I understand the people in my organization? Am I going to hire the right people, have the right qualities to work well in this environment? And then are we going to really be able to be effective in giving feedback or receiving feedback and being receptive to that without getting defensive? So those are all really incredible, important attributes.
Thank you, everyone. So I got the 5-minute mark, so I just
Oh,
wanted
okay.
to open it to the audience. So maybe we could take 1 or 2 last questions, and get some thoughts from the audience. So we'll start with the gentleman on the side here, please. We'll just try and work across.
Thank you so much, you all. I have a question, I think either for Mark or Chuck. So I do advise, I do some consulting entering the African market. So I had a client where I started to realize they give you a pushback in terms of helping them do cultural assessment. They were trying to enter a particular country in Africa, but they missed the deal in terms of within the branding and marketing strategy. And then unfortunately it's now part of the consultant contract. And I'm saying to myself, should I help them or not? You know, in an aspect, how would you sort of kind of respond to that? Because obviously at the end of the day, market research and leadership culture, it's very important across global markets. But I think my question to you, how would you sort of advise whether us, you know, as American, go over there back and forth, the value of just within the leadership team, everybody had to be on the same page. I mean, you had the marketing went on the same page, leaders not on the same page, and literally just the deal was lost. I hope that made sense, but.
Do you want to take it, Chuck?
Go for it, Mark.
Go for it. So I guess we talked about something that was really important early on, and that's alignment. So whether it be with our employees or with our domestic partners, it's got to be there with, even more importantly, with our international or global partners as well. And I guess not only with a part of alignment, but what does success look like? Is it going to be a win-win for both sides to be able to get together? Otherwise, it should be no deal. Just don't even go forward. I know from our end, I happen to be a member of Boston Harbor Angels as well, and when we're working with founders of early stage startups or otherwise, we want to make sure that not only are they motivated, they generally are, but they're coachable, that they're willing to listen. And I think that's important regardless of who you bring in. If somebody is a know-it-all, you know what? No room for them here. We want people who want to be learning, you know what, who are coachable, who, you know what, have a common purpose, vision, are seeking win-win. And if they don't have those things, you know what, move away, do a different deal. So I'm not sure. Maybe you lost that one. It could be the best thing that happened to you, so you can actually find a better partner next time.
You can't, if you're having the right conversation to try to connect the dots for them in terms of the impact of alignment for all those functions, the executive team's ability to execute their vision, their strategy, if they're not seeing that, then it is best to walk away, because, you know, if someone's not buying into it, if someone's not seeing the value proposition, you can't convince them of that. You know, there's the whole adage, the expression, until their back's against the wall, and sometimes it's too late at that point to be able to drive the changes they need to make. So you can only do so much when it comes to having the right conversations and getting them to understand the impact of doing what you're suggesting.
Yeah, I would add is probably a SWOT analysis on the people, product, and process, right? So if you go back and look at kind of what went well, what didn't, you know, you start asking some of those questions, you might be able to find, and people start rambling, maybe they weren't effective in how they communicated, maybe the business plan wasn't as tight as we originally thought it was, maybe they didn't have the right empathy to actually go into that market and really relate and connect to be able to close the deal, right? So it could be people related, could be the process you went about that, or, you know, it could be the products that you put in front of them, yeah.
Thank you for so many helpful insights, and I like the saying, culture trumps strategy. Also like your point that really being aligned on values is essential very early on. My question is, what frameworks or approaches have you seen startups use to get to alignment on values? And secondly, when they went to other countries, how did they assess what things they had to tweak? Because I've worked both in the US and in the UK, and I remember there's English in English, but it's completely different.
I've done a lot of talking, so I really want to make it open to someone else here on the panel.
Tim, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think assessment-wise, you know, we've mentioned a couple of the assessments that, you know, I've worked at with startups. I think the one thing that I would say to be careful of, that we didn't talk about on the assessments, is hiring too many people that are very much like you. And I did work at a startup where that most certainly happened. I was the different person. Everybody else was exactly the same. And so I think, you know, assessments are important. I agree with with what you're saying, where UK English, even across the UK, is different. I mean, even in the US, English is different. Take Spanish, and there's Spanish, and there's Mexican Spanish. And so I think you have to you have to be able to adapt. And then all the things that we're sort of saying, you've got to listen to the people, you've got to be curious, you've got to be open, and you've got to be willing to adjust as quickly as you possibly can. But I can't stress enough, don't hire all Ds on the disc, or because you are a D and you want to go into the market. So make sure you're looking at that overall and assessing.
Yeah, I'll add to this. I think taking a step back, I always like to crowdsource. Sometimes your best testers of your culture or the product could be your staff, employees. So figuring out where those ecosystems are in the organization and asking them really, I won't give you all the questions, but there's a question set, a number of questions that you can ask to kind of get down and distill those kind of important values that could be just customized just for your business and your organization. And you can discover that really effectively very quickly through the right formats. I can share some of those with you offline. Yeah.
It's a great question because it's a deeper, it takes a little more time than we have here right now, but essentially you have to go through an exercise discussing what you mean by what your values are to gain that alignment and what those specific behaviors that demonstrate those values. And then when you factor in multinational cultures, I mean, a working norm in one country can be very, very different. So yeah, there's many different layers here because there's language differences. You can add French to that equation, and there's cultural norms in terms of how we operate, how we make decisions, how we communicate, how we just operate day to day, how we manage, frankly, are different depending what country you're talking about. So values becomes very complicated when you're talking multinational. But you still have to start with a conversation of what we mean and how does that tie into our brand of who we want to be and what kind of work environment we're trying to create. So you got to start there, and it has to be, frankly, you have to have someone that has some expertise to facilitate that. I think it's difficult to do that, organically on your own when it's a pretty complicated conversation.
Yeah, probably I'd add one more thing. I think it's complicated, but it isn't. But you definitely have to have someone really expert to be able to facilitate that. So it's like, what's working well, what's not. What do we want to start, continue, and then how do you I still go back to one of the best frameworks I've seen was the Irresistible Organization. If you read that article by Josh Burson, and the framework and the visualization he puts out in just one slide really helps you encapsulate an aspirational kind of what culture are we building, what value sets do we want to kind of start to really think through, and going through that, like you said, as Chuck was saying, going through that exercise to really figure that out.
Maybe one final comment on values, and this is for everybody. As you're thinking about values as well, there's really two types. There's core values, which is how we engage with others, very, very important. But also think about strategic values. As you're making decisions in your organization, what do you want that to be? So some organizations I work with, innovation. So they always want to be innovative in whatever they do. That's a strategic value. Or they're data-driven. They want to make sure that their decisions are based on data. So you have core values, and you also have strategic values you might want to think about.
Thank you so much. Well, we are at time now. So I just want to reflect in the beginning. I started with an intentional mistake. I picked on someone in the crowd. And this often happens in sales because we want to be tunnel visioned on that person, that sale. And we want to think about, I want to communicate with them. And we don't think about how they're feeling or the crowd or the audience and the perception of the brand value. So really it was to make a point that, this is so important, the foundation, because I think we've heard about understanding, setting the values, the foundation, the brand, the way people perceive you internally and externally is so critical. And ultimately, it's all about the values that you want to be known for by your customers and by your team. So just like to say a huge thank you to the panel. And that brings us to a close of the session. Thank you to our amazing audience. Hope you enjoy the rest of Startup Boston.
If anybody wants to learn more about DISC, feel free to take these.
Before you guys leave, I'm sorry. Thank you to our panel. And thank you for being here and taking the time. Quickly, I do want to say we do have a keynote speaker today here at 6 p.m. Two keynote speakers, actually. Yvonne Howe, and she's the Secretary of Economic Development. And then we have Boston Globe's Scott Krisner right here at 6 p.m. today. So please join us. And then in this room, the next session will be at 10:15, leveraging debt financing beyond equity for growth. So please join us. And then lastly, I just want to thank Suffolk University for taking the time to host us. Thank you all.
Sorry, I didn't realize the final hand.